Dow asked us to look at what would be a likely and a possibly high case for LNG exports. We looked at third-party analysis of how LNG demand would grow over time. It's grown 8% historically. You cut it 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, it's grown about 8% a year. Forecasts are around 4 to 6% per year. This demand growth creates a range of LNG supply shortage of 20 to 35 BCF per day by 2030. I think it's important to realize that 30 BCFD of new U.S. export terminals have been announced. 18 of those BCFDs are at existing import terminals. So a 20 BCFD case isn't that unlikely. The fundamentals also suggest that the U.S. could supply this gap. Asian LNG remains priced near oil parity. The Asian markets remain fairly insensitive to increases in LNG prices. We actually had a conversation with some Australian investment bankers a few weeks ago that sat down and told us directly that the U.S. is in one of the most competitive positions to export natural gas. Their argument was that the effects of natural gas demand for LNG export in Australia have raised contract prices up to about $8 on the East Coast and 4 or 5 so on the West Coast, plus the $6 or so to convert the gas and liquefy it and get it ready for shipment. That doesn't include the cost for transportation to get to LNG markets. And their argument was, and we believe, and we agree, is that the U.S. is much more competitive than Australia. So what did we do? We looked at manufacturing, electricity generation, natural gas growth in these two scenarios. We corrected for some of what we believe are the low demands that EIA is forecasting in its base case, and we came up with 2 scenarios. The first scenario says if you layer all these together, this is not in an integrated fashion, and I realize that, if you layer them together, you see a 2.7% annual growth in LNG exports in the likely scenario and 3.3% in the high scenario. The next step we did was to take these scenarios and run them through our gas model. First, we took a look at EIA's natural gas demand in its AEO 2013 early release. And we found that gas prices in 2030 would amount to about $6.30. That's about 90 cents or so above what EIA is estimating. Then we made some adjustments in what we believe EIA made a few demand forecasts, what we call possibly errors in its forecast, and we got about $7.20 in terms of a 2030 price. We then layered in likely and high export scenarios and found that the prices could range from $8.80 to $10.30 in 2012 dollars.
U.S. price increases never get very large. They are limited by the willingness of foreign buyers to buy the gas from us, and that is limited by the availability of other sellers who can undercut the U.S. price. And if you take a look at a reasonable representation of what the fully allocated costs are of getting gas, for example, to Japan from all the different regions, the answer is it's gutter that is the gorilla in the room. Gutter can undercut everybody, and several places. Leave out Australia. They've managed to screw it up. Their labor unions and rent-seeking can even certainly can prevent them from exporting natural gas efficiently. But why is any of this controversial? Because conclusions about the benefits of free trade, the qualitative conclusion, doesn't depend on the energy intensity or the growth rate of manufacturing. It doesn't depend on what baseline forecast you're using for natural gas. It doesn't depend on your level of industry detail. It doesn't even depend on what the outcomes are that you find for exports. We found actually that for the most part what it takes for the U.S. to export natural gas is high estimated ultimate recovery of shale gas. We need cheap gas in order to be exporters. There are highly unusual circumstances in which a global crunch on supply, that is, gutter has a revolution. Japan and Korea go off nuclear. Australia remains unable to export natural gas. Under those circumstances, we might export natural gas in the reference case assumptions that EIA had back then. But for the most part, what we're looking at is exporting gas when we have cheap gas down around $4 a million BTU and adding 20, 30, or 40 cents to that. So what does that add up actually meaning? Oh, good. Of course, the exports will raise U.S. prices and will lower our rivals' costs, but it doesn't matter. U.S. manufacturing will still retain an immense gas cost advantage. Why haven't we heard anything about this? Well, the fact is there is going to be a built-in 2-to-1 gas cost advantage for U.S. manufacturing against any of its rivals in countries that import natural gas. And it's very simple. If you take a U.S. wellhead price of $6 and you add what just about everybody agrees is a reasonable transportation cost of $6 to get from the Gulf Coast to Asian markets, you end up doubling the U.S. price in the Asian markets. If the U.S. chemicals industry can't survive when its competitors pay twice as much for natural gas as it does, then that implies to me that we have learned a very important fact about comparative advantage, which is that the U.S. does not have a comparative advantage in chemicals, and we would be far better off importing chemicals from places where they can be produced by an efficient industry and concentrating in the U.S. on doing what we do efficiently. But that's not going to be the case, because the U.S. chemicals industry is nowhere near the marginal supplier of chemicals in the world. It's actually quite an efficient industry. And all it will get out of gas prices that are 50 cents or so lower is higher returns to its shareholders, not to the average consumer, not to the buyer of natural gas. And if it's 50 cents less, the chemical industry will get less returns to its shareholders, and all the industries associated with building natural gas will gain.